conflict and why you're joining us here today and where you're joining us from. Sigun, I realize I can't actually see the chat.
I can. I think it's that little T looking symbol under the word crisis, like way at the bottom. Like, yeah, so the see little squares and then 2 over from there to the right, I think is the full, yeah, I think that's the presentation mode.
Could you see my notes before?
Yeah.
Oh,
and the other slides, and now we can't.
Okay.
Now it's good.
All right. Well, I actually can't see the chat to see people's responses, but hopefully you all can.
I will monitor the chat.
Okay. All right. So today I'll be talking to you about Nonviolent Peace Force's work. So as was mentioned, we reimagine reimagine safety and security in situations of violence. And today I'll be talking to you about Nonviolent Peace Force's work in conflict areas with a spotlight on Ukraine, the methods we use of unarmed civilian protection, and yeah. So I wanted to first share with you a story. These are 2 people that our team met in Kharkiv. And just for a second, I'd like you to imagine or think about if you've been a caregiver for someone, if you are currently a caregiver for someone, if you've been on bed rest before, if you've been sick and needed medication for a long-term illness, if you've needed to access social services. And now think about if war breaks out. You're unable to leave your apartment due to being bedridden. You cannot, if you're a caregiver, you can't leave, you can't take the person with you who's bedridden to safety. And even in some situations, if you are able to do so, the place where you would bring them doesn't have the medical services that you would need to provide for them. Pharmacies are closed, you can't get your medication, and a number of social workers have left the area where you live, so you're unable to access social services. Some social services that were available before, like a domestic violence shelter, have now been turned into residents for people to stay in during the war. So these are the people that Nonviolent Peace Force is working to support in Ukraine, the most vulnerable people, people who are older, people who are disabled, sometimes children, but unfortunately, a lot of children have been evacuated out of the front lines. And this is a couple that we met when we first started doing, I didn't meet personally, our team met when we first started doing an assessment in Ukraine. So this is Tatiana and Konstantin. Konstantin broke his hip just before the war. And when it started, they were unable to leave their apartment. So they've been terrified hearing bombing going off all day. Everybody else in the building has been able to go to the basement, which isn't in much better condition since there's sewage leaking from the roof. It's very cold down there and there's no light at any time of the day. But Nonviolent Peace Force is working to connect people like Tatiana and Konstantin to resources to get them to safety. And I'll go more into that later. And this is a story about Zina. Zina's 2 daughters fled at the beginning of the war to Slovenia. And Zina didn't want to go. She said she didn't know the language and didn't feel there was anything there for her. She's 75 years old, and she stayed with her cat named Belushka, who she says is the man of the house. Belushka is the only person she has conversations with. And she was going to a water distribution point to get water and collapsed from heat exhaustion. So Nonviolent Peaceforce accompanied her back to her apartment to get to safety. So this is another example of the people we are trying to help. Okay. I think I'm going to stop share to do this activity. So I want everybody to think about the news you hear in Ukraine and what kind of headlines you hear, and type it in the chat. So when I notice people's responses from before, so a lot of people, when they think of conflict, I'm thinking of terrorism, military. And so something we say at Nonviolent Peaceforce is conflict is inevitable, but violence is not. So people are saying they hear nothing about ceasefire and peace negotiations. Towns that have been occupied and changed hands. Civilians who've died, soldiers, Russians advancing, bombing. Headlines of death, destruction, displacement, running out of ammunition, Ukrainians. Not individual people, just the war. And need for military resources, weapons. Bombings of civilian houses and power plants. Okay, thank you everyone for sharing. Ugh. So these are some headlines about nonviolent action that is happening in Ukraine. So I wonder what support there would be for nonviolent action if more people read headlines like these about, sorry, my baby's crying, about civilians who are standing up against the war, Russians who have voiced their opinion against the war, the 150 clergy people in Russia who have spoken out against war, Ukrainians who have chanted and reprimanded Russian troops who've stood in front of tanks. And if we had these stories instead, would there be more support for the work that Nonviolent Peaceforce is doing in Ukraine to protect civilians through nonviolent methods? So as you know, and you've probably heard this statistic in other presentations you've had, by 2021, UNHCR reported there was 89.3 million people displaced around the world. And that doesn't include what the people who've been displaced since the Ukrainian war started. So there's 8 million people who are refugees in Europe and 6.9 million people displaced within the country. And yet we continue to spend billions and billions on war. Actually, the total expenditure in 2021 globally was over 2 trillion for the first time. The US alone spent over 800 billion on military. And the increase in military spending worldwide increased 18.8% in 2021. Yet in the last 11 of the previous 14 years, peace has deteriorated, and this is measured by the Global Peace Index, which studies, I believe, 176 countries around the world for levels of peace, and has indicated that each country. Do you have a question, Kathy? Okay, no. Has dropped an average of 3.2 points. And if you'd like, you can check out the Global Peace Index at the Vision of Humanity. So what people are looking around for around the world are different ways to keep themselves safe. They're reimagining safety from here, governments and institutions, from local communities in the US to around the world are looking for different ways to keep safe. Nonviolent Peaceforce was actually invited by the UN after they transitioned out of Darfur in Sudan to go in and provide unarmed protection, as there was a protection gap following their transition out of the country. So there's different people and places all around the world looking for different ways to keep themselves safe. And Nonviolent Peaceforce's mission is to protect people in violent conflicts through unarmed strategies, to work side by side with local communities to build peace, and to advocate for the adoption of these approaches to safeguard human lives and dignity. So what Nonviolent Peaceforce does is something called unarmed civilian protection. And there are examples of this throughout our history. If you think about the Underground Railroad, it was mainly a nonviolent movement to get people safely out of slavery along the Underground Railroad. So this is always, for thousands of years, people have been doing this type of work. By the mid-20th century, there was more formal, organized groups trying to do nonviolent responses. So Gandhi was working on creating the Shanti Sena during his lifetime before he was assassinated in 1984. Abdul Ghaffar Khan, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name without my notes, but worked on creating a group called Servants of God. And they gathered over 100,000 people who stood between interposed themselves between British troops and the local community to protect people. So those are some earlier examples of when people began organizing. He was also Pashtun, and Gandhi and Abdul Ghaffar Khan are actually two of Malala Yousafzai's role models. So I thought that was interesting. There was more of this work started being done in the 1980s, such as through peace brigades, providing accompaniment for people, Christian peacemakers teams, which is now called community peacemaking teams, brigadistas, or international as brigadistas. And then in the late 1980s, we actually had people providing unarmed defense for natural resources. So there was Chico Mendes in the late mid-1980s, who used his presence to protect the protect the rainforest from extractive industries and from cattle ranchers with I think it's the Rubber Tappers Union. There was also a woman named Julia Butterfly who stayed in a tree for 743 days to protect a redwood tree in California. I'm going to stop share again and ask if anybody has any other examples that they would like to share throughout history.
I was lucky enough to meet the parents of Rachel Corey, who stood in front of a house that was being demolished or threatened to be demolished in Palestine. And the Israeli tank driver or bulldozer driver was aware of her, but drove over her and killed her with the bulldozer. But she was there for nonviolent resistance support or support of the civilians.
Appreciate you sharing. And there, it is dangerous to stand between people without weapons. And I know that a number of organizations have had people killed, but it's also strategic, and sometimes you can get the moral high ground that way as well. And people start thinking of you as more of a human. Feel free to put it in the chat if you would like as well. I also wanted to mention there was, during World War II, there was a fisherman who accompanied 1,400 Jews to Sweden on fisher boats. That's another example of unarmed accompaniment as well.
Witness for Peace is another organization that has done accompaniment in Colombia that I'm aware of.
Yes, and they also started in the 1980s.
As I recall, in Denmark, during World War II, the king would ride down the street every day on his horse, and workers would come out, and then they'd call in sick, or they said they'd have to go to the farm that day because they were having to build warships. So that's another way of resisting.
Refusing to participate.
I guess I would, excuse me, add the civil rights movement in the US with Martin Luther King Jr. I don't think anyone's mentioned that. And I work with several human rights defenders in China who use nonviolent methods, and including the A4 paper protest recently in November was a creative way of protesting and nonviolent.
Okay, and there's a couple answers in the chat. So Ukrainian language learning for ethnic Russians, strangers helping each other. A boat named Phoenix with Betty Boardman of the Madison on crew delivered medical supplies to Hanoi. Many peaceful protests over the past few years, to bring attention to violence about policing and escorting women to abortion clinics. Okay. Oops. Okay, and so then in the new millennium, we had larger non-governmental organizations. We might be mid-sized, but starting to do the work of unarmed civilian protection, like Cure Violence and Nonviolent Peaceforce. And then there's smaller groups and who are doing more targeted work, and it's becoming increasingly sophisticated. So there's the International Fellowship for Reconciliation, has certain branches and affiliates that do accompaniment. So the Swedish branch of I4 accompanies people along the US-Mexico border and in Colombia. The World Council of Churches has a ecumenical program in Israel-Palestine to accompany people. And then in 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, groups started doing more domestic work. So groups like Cure Violence, Meta Peace Teams, Christian peace teams are community peace teams now, and also Nonviolent Peaceforce. And today there's over 48 organizations doing this work in 24 regions, according to the UCP database at Selkirk College. 21 colleges and universities that we know of offer coursework on armed civilian protection. 9 UN agencies fund this work. So not just Nonviolent Peaceforce, but organizations doing this work. 11 government institutions fund it. The UN, the European Union provides funding. So 15 country missions with Nonviolent Peaceforce have hosted events on unarmed civilian protection. As was mentioned in the description of the event, there's 27 UN reports, policies, and recommendations. So the 2015 high-level peace operations panel report stated that unarmed strategies must be at the forefront of efforts to protect civilians. So there's a lot more recognition that we can protect people through nonviolent methods. And this is the 3rd year in a row that the US appropriations bill has included language on unarmed civilian protection. And then, as I mentioned, the UN has invited Nonviolent Peaceforce, and we've been doing work in Sudan after the peacekeepers transitioned out. This is just the quote from the appropriations bill. So they directed, the Secretary of State directed USAID to provide funds for this type of work. Okay. And Nonviolent Peaceforce, a lot of this work has been led by people at Nonviolent Peaceforce, Mel Duncan, our founder. We also have other advocacy staff. And so we've been working on building a community of practice to bring practitioners together, to learn from each other, and to scale up this work around the world. So the first part of this was doing case studies in 4 different areas. So was 2 areas where Nonviolent Peaceforce does not work, and 2 areas where we do work. South Sudan and the Philippines, where Nonviolent Peaceforce works, looking at the groups that are doing this work to find the good practices. And 77 of them were identified. And then, so this was compiled in this textbook, these case studies. And then there was 6 workshops facilitated in regions, different regions. So Manila, Beirut, Nairobi, Bogota, Minnesota, and Europe. And then after that, all these groups were brought together for a large international conference. The first one had to be virtual because of COVID. So we had 180 people participate from 160 organizations and from 45 different countries, and had 22 different workshops. And there's going to be a out of this came 2 working groups. So one on lifting the voices of local community and on decolonizing unarmed civilian protection. There's, I think, a perception that a lot of unarmed civilian protection or accompanying people is done by white foreigners, international people going to a different country and standing alongside others to protect them. And so we want to look at how do local communities also protect each other, and how do we decolonize the work. And we continue for all of these. There's reports published, and the findings are shared. So. Okay, so this is the methods, all the methods of unarmed civilian protection that are used. I'll just go over a few of them. So Nonviolent Peaceforce is nonpartisan. So that means we don't take sides in a conflict for the safety of our staff, and we have to work with all sides. So in some places, for instance, like the Philippines, we've been there in 2007 in Mindanao, and we've had to work with the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And so we build relationships, and with the local community, of course, we build relationship with all these actors. And so when violence breaks out, for instance, there was a village with 600 people in it, and they heard that an armed group was coming into the area and everyone was preparing to flee. Because Nonviolent Peaceforce had built relationship, they called the commanders and they said, you know, we hear that you are planning on coming to this area. We know that you don't want to break the ceasefire, and you care about the protection of civilians. And we had people, our peacekeepers or protection officers, stay present there, and they never came to the village, and 600 people were able to stay there. So we're not neutral. We follow international humanitarian law, and we will say, you know, like condemn human rights abuses, but we also have to build relationships with all parties to keep people safe and to do the work. It's focused on local people. So the work is led by local communities. We just work to enhance people's capacity to be able to do this work. Our work is independent, so a lot of the organizations that do unarmed civilian protection aren't restricted by the bureaucracies of government or larger organizations, so we can go be flexible and go into places where other organizations may not be able to, like in Ukraine right now. We're working on the front lines where security protocols keep some of the larger NGOs from entering those areas, but it's also the areas where people have the most need. And it's nonviolent, so our staff are unarmed, all civilians, and we're able to do our work through building relationships, being trained in de-escalation, and these other methods. So, as I mentioned, all our work is civilians protecting other civilians. So it's trained civilians protecting well-trained civilians protecting other civilians through unarmed methods. Our teams are multinational, so we have international staff, but also half of our staff are from the host country themselves. So like in Ukraine, we might start with mainly international staff going in until we get to know the local context. And now we've hired more Ukrainian staff. So we aim to have half of the staff be Ukrainian. And so we have a lot of Ukrainian staff now as well. deeply immersed in the community. So our protection officers often live in the communities in sometimes in remote areas. And we work alongside the community. So we're responsive to the local context. So, you know, we have to be able to be flexible and change the work depending on the context. You know, every conflict is not the same. So we wouldn't do the exact same thing we do in South Sudan or in the Philippines, especially because those conflicts are at different stages as well. And it's very cost effective. It's a fraction of what a armed mission would cost as well. Okay. Wondering if this is blocking the top here. So there's different types of nonviolent action, and I just want to talk about where unarmed civilian protection fits in. So there's civil resistance, so that's to challenge the status quo. So for instance, when police kill someone who's Black and they don't face consequences and people protest, so there is consequences for those officers, that is something to challenge the status quo. That would be like nonviolent protests. And then civil defense, which is defending the status quo. So when people want to put pipelines in on sacred land or water, you want to that's defending through nonviolent methods, through your presence, so that those oil pipelines can't be put in. And then unarmed civilian protection is creating a safer space so civilians can address their own needs and solve their own conflicts. So it's protecting people so that they can do peace building. So these are the areas where Nonviolent Peaceforce is working. So it actually says Global Support Office, but we have a program in the US here, our program in Ukraine, Iraq, Sudan, South Sudan, Thailand, Myanmar. We're just, okay, I guess I'm not, we're doing advocacy in Indonesia and working in the Philippines. I'm going to start talking about our work specifically in Ukraine. So Nonviolent Peaceforce initially did some work in Ukraine in 2015. We trained over 30 leaders from civil society organizations in unarmed civilian protection. And at that time, a ceasefire was signed between Russia and Ukraine. And unfortunately, funders lost interest. No longer wanted to fund this work since it wasn't seen as a crisis, which unfortunately happens a lot of times, and weren't focused on the longer term peace building work. But using the relationships that we had built through this work, we're able to start work again when Russia invaded Ukraine last year. So these are the areas where Nonviolent Peaceforce is doing work. Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Kharkiv, and Kyiv. Just let me look at it for a second. So in all of the, I'm talking about the methods that we're using in Ukraine, but accompaniment is unarmed accompaniment. Protective accompaniment is something that Nonviolent Peaceforce does in all our programs. So it's not just someone who's unarmed walking along with someone to get them safely to another place. There's a lot of thought and planning that goes into security for the people that we're accompanying. So some of the things that Nonviolent Peaceforce might do is go along the route and do a risk assessment, see where the risks are along the route, stay up to date on security briefings from any partners, which could include like armed forces, could include UN security briefings. So we know what's happening in the area, building relationships with people along those routes who can alert us if the situation has changed and it might not be as safe, like for instance, if militia are entering an area. And then also at times, it can be helpful to have an international presence depending on the conflict, and people wearing visibility for the organization. And then all of our people who do accompany people are well trained, trained to keep people safe and to be able to de-escalate situations. So in Ukraine, a couple of the things we're doing is we're working with our local partners. So we're there to support the local people doing the work. Those are the people who are on the front lines. So one organization we're working with is the 10th of April, and we've helped them to organize evacuation for over 200 people to get out of the front lines to other areas, and helped arrange buses and fuel for them as well, and drivers. And then working with Help Kharkiv. So when people are fleeing war, they often forget to take their important documents with them. So one of the things we're trained to do is actually make a quick run big, so you have your documents and anything important, so if you have to flee quickly. But a lot of civilians aren't prepared to flee, so they forget things like their passports, and then they can't access social services. They cannot withdraw funds from the bank, and it's actually very dangerous. They can't cross the border legally, and they can't get past military checkpoints. And so Nonviolent Peaceforce, working with our partners, built relationships and been able to accompany people to get these documents so that they can access these services. And we've accompanied over 100 people through military checkpoints that they usually can't get through, so that they can get their documents. So this is one person we supported, Victoria. See her quote there. Now that I have a passport, I can register in Mykolaiv at the social center to receive a free referral for rehabilitation due to my disability. I express my sincere gratitude to Nonviolent Peaceforce and all your employees for assistance in reissuing my passport. God bless you all, and good health to everyone. Hugs to everyone. So as I mentioned, the people we're focusing on are the most vulnerable, those who are older, disabled, and making sure that they can get connected to resources. So Nonviolent Peaceforce is really there to support community safety. And a lot of the work that's being done on the front lines is led by volunteers, national organizations, and the larger NGOs are kind of working along the border and maybe getting aid to central areas like Odessa and Mykolaiv, but not to other areas that have been occupied by Russian forces and then liberated as well, the regions outside of the cities. So we really want to support our partners who are taking on the majority of that response, which are also local civil society organizations. They are doing really amazing work. A lot of this is led by civilians who've been affected by the war themselves. So we might have people who've been displaced by another in another area come and be helping other civilians. And all the conflicts that Nonviolent Peaceforce works in, we can see that it's always civilians who are stepping up to show solidarity and to support one another. It's hard for these organizations, the people doing this work, because they don't have time to stop and network with each other. And they don't have time to learn what other organizations are doing and what other resources are available. So that is a role that Nonviolent Peaceforce has taken on. And we've also been able to identify the needs of our local partners. So these are my little pictures. So as I mentioned, a lot of the organizations that we've interviewed are not aware of what resources are available from larger NGOs. Oops. And also then the civilians in the areas don't have access to these resources and don't know what's available to them. There's protection issues arising that like local civil society organizations and volunteer groups are not aware of, such as around water distribution points. So I know like in other countries, a lot of times places where people collect aid, if they're out there waiting in bad weather for a long time, it also can lead to conflict for people within the line. If you're waiting there in the hot sun for 8 hours, you also can collapse to heat exhaustion, as I mentioned earlier. It can also be a place where bad actors can go and also target people. And it also means that a lot of civilians are gathered in one place, which makes it a target as well. So this is just my picture to show Mykolaiv and Odessa. So these are the areas where a lot of the aid is going, and it's not being distributed to the regions around there. There's also an issue where like people in the city are getting a lot of aid. So they met one woman who had her whole apartment stocked full of things, and then another elderly couple who were by themselves and had absolutely nothing. So there's a problem with doubling aid for people and other people also not getting it. This money symbol is to recognize the lack of resources. So a lot of the aid going to the larger organizations, NGOs, is trickling down, and then it gets to the centralized points, and then it gets to the partners, the local groups. And by that time, there's just a very small pot of resources left. So Nonviolent Peaceforce is advocating for the larger NGOs to integrate these local groups into their work, and also help them, provide them funds and hire local people. So there's a lack of awareness about mine safety and no training for these local organizations on mine safety. So we've started, because nobody was distributing information at the central points on mine awareness. Like, we started providing pamphlets on mine safety and like how parents can keep their children safe from mines. And one mother with her child was just like so grateful that she had learned how she can teach her child about mine safety, because there's been a lack of that. And then also because a lot of the response on the front lines is volunteer led, people are not trained in like safeguarding practices and protection principles that a lot of the larger NGOs are trained in. So people are not learning, you know, these principles of doing no harm and what your requirements are for reporting, what you do if you see sexual harassment happening. And so there's a lack of that happening. And then a lack of coordination as well. Okay, Sigurinn, I don't know how much time we have, so I could wrap
How
up.
long is the video?
It's like 4 minutes.
Oh yeah, I think we have time for that.
Okay.
Unless you have a lot more afterwards.
I don't have to go into all of it. I was going to talk about more of
because we have to.
around the world, but we can do Q&A and
All right, so we'll show the video and then
okay. And I'll stop share here.
We're here together with our partners Dream Action, who organize distributions in villages like this where international organizations are not able to come and do. So they're doing localized distributions. Today they're distributing hygiene kits to a local group that will then distribute it further out to people here who live in this village. So this village is really close to the front lines. It's been really directly and heavily impacted by the fighting, active fighting, both shelling and ground fighting. You can see that when you look around. You can see buildings are damaged, crops have been not taken in. There's a lot of remnants of war around here. You can hear outgoing artillery happening while we're here. So it's really heavily impacted. Nothing is working in terms of economy, so that the people who live here are really dependent on the aid that's being brought in. I mean, seeing this level of destruction and then seeing something like this, a piano, and what we see in front of us here is somebody's teddy bear, is such a reminder of the correlation and the reality of where human life meets destruction and war, and the absolute senselessness of it all, the level of destruction and what the impact it has had on this community, and for the generations to come as they remember this experience, is why we all should be working for other alternatives to violence.
Зараз ми знаходимося в школі, яка раніше була школою. Зараз від цього місця майже нічого не залишилося. Це місце розтрощено і, на жаль, тут загинуло дуже багато людей, цивільних людей. І мені дуже шкода, що те місце, в якому навчалися діти, воно зараз абсолютно непридатне до навчання, і єдине рішення – це навчання дітей онлайн. Але в селі наразі залишилося дуже багато дітей, і сьогодні, коли ми видавали ці гігієнічні набори, ми бачили, яка велика кількість сімей з дітьми. І я думаю, що ця школа їм була дуже необхідна. Ми вже не вперше допомагаємо цій сільській громаді. До нас зверталися про допомогу. Ми давали декілька генераторів, ми давали ковдри, матраци, подушки, деякі інші необхідні речі із медикаментів. Іноді до нас можуть звертатися за продуктовими наборами або гігієнічними наборами. Тобто все, чим ми займаємося, все, чим ми можемо допомогти, всі заявки, які приходять на нашу громадську організацію, на наш волонтерський штаб, ми всі опрацьовуємо і намагаємось максимально допомогти або самостійно, або за допомогою фондів, які йдуть нам на зустріч. І ми дуже вдячні за те, що іноземні фонди не залишають нас наодинці зі своєю проблемою, а допомагають нам разом. Бо лише разом ми можемо більше допомогти людям. На жаль, зараз є велика проблема, тому що деякі фонди нам допомагають, але дуже треба багато часу для того, щоб отримати цю допомогу, а ми не можемо чекати. Нам треба ця допомога людям тут і зараз. Ми не можемо півроку чекати генератори або якісь обігрівачі, тому що холодно у людей зараз вже в цих селах. У них з початку війни немає світла, у них немає газу, і якщо вони залишаться у своїх домівках, вони просто замерзнуть.
this area is very close to the front lines. Organizations have very strong security protocols for obvious reasons. It's difficult to get to for those reasons, and there's a lot of need. So it's not every home, not every village, not every community gets what it needs. But we're here and we're working with a local organization. Most importantly, I mean, we're here as their guests and in support and in partnership of them. Dream Action is leading the way on making sure that this community here is getting what they need and helping us. And what we can really do right now is use our voice and our ability and our connections to in other places, to other sources and other resources, and to try and get some resources here. This community needs generators, it needs heaters, it needs the ability to cook, it needs sources so that they can have light and electricity and to charge their phones and their communication devices over the course of the winter.
All right. All right. Sorry.
Sigler, I think she has about 15 more minutes before we have to go to question and answer, because we do go to 8:30 at times.
Okay.
Yeah, we try to leave about 15 to 20 minutes for
Okay.
Q&A.
Okay, so I'll go back to the presentation here. Closed it. Oops. Come on. All right. So that was an example of one of the partners we're working with. And so this is what Nonviolent Peaceforce can do. We can work to connect people to aid. So Nonviolent Peaceforce doesn't actually distribute material aid ourselves, but we try to think of protection in a holistic way. So it's not just physically protecting people, but also making sure that people have the resources they need, which helps them to stay safe. So in Odessa, there has been a very organized response. The city was able to take on coordinating between the different organizations so that they can keep track of where aid is going to and what resources are available. In Mykolaiv, that wasn't able to happen. And so it's very disorganized. So Nonviolent Peaceforce has been working with our partners to create an international humanitarian register to keep track of all the resources that are available in a database, basically. So we're able to refer civilians and let organizations know what else is being offered, so they can also refer people to get resources, and just have a more coordinated response so people aren't getting double aid, and then people who are in certain areas are able to get aid as well. So we're advocating for large NGOs to support aid going not just to these centralized areas, but to regions outside of these areas. And I already mentioned that. We loan resources to our partners. So for instance, Bulletproof Vest for partners who are going even deeper into the front lines. Like some of the groups are, after areas are liberated, once the mines are cleared, are going in and delivering aid. And we're directly transferring funds to our partner organizations because they're the ones directly providing support to civilians, and they are the ones on the front lines. So the things they need are like these things called garions, which is like cement in these wire cages to put around water distribution sites to keep people safe if there's shelling. Winterization supplies, so fuel for generators and blankets, things like that to keep people warm. The ability for them to have power stations so that they can connect their mobile phones and stay updated on the situation. When we were in Harrison, someone went up to our protection officer and asked who held the area. They didn't even know if it had been liberated yet. So there's a lack of information about what's going on, so it's hard for people to keep safe. We're educating and training people on mine safety. We're working on putting together a mobile team to respond in these decentralized areas, and we'll have also 2 psychologists who can help as well and refer and get people to where they need to go. And then we're training our partners in unarmed civil protection so they can keep themselves safe and the communities that they work with safe. And then we have also put together the biggest conference that in Ukraine for these groups, the local civil society organization, volunteer groups, national groups, and the larger NGOs that happened on November 10th. And that was the first time that these smaller groups are able to advocate to the larger NGOs for what their needs are, and people are able to begin working on a coordinated response. They started working on the International Humanitarian Register to keep track of all the resources that people have, and also included the local authorities because they have a lot of capacity to do that as well. Well, that's just a picture of the conference. Okay, and then I just wanted to share with you some examples from the work we're doing in other places around the world, because our Ukraine program is fairly new. So a lot of the work that we started doing in 2020 was direct protection. So having a presence at protest. We first started with providing protection during the last federal election at the polls to keep people safe and workers safe as they voted. Providing protection at protests. So here in Minneapolis, after the murder of Dante Wright, providing unarmed protection there. And then when the police officers were not contracted anymore to provide security at Minneapolis public schools, Nonviolent Peaceforce was one of the groups that provided training for the new safety and security advisors on providing safety in the school, and that would be through more de-escalation and relationship building with the students. We've continued work in Minneapolis public schools. Now we are advisors for a project that's led by students, and students have created these peace advisory groups. So we provided training to them, and they're taking leadership, providing safety and security in the schools themselves. We also partnered with an organization called Emerge, who works with young men who've been formerly incarcerated or involved or associated with gangs, provided training to those young men, and a local high school had contacted Nonviolent Peaceforce because they were concerned about gunshots going off during the day. And so Nonviolent Peaceforce with several of the young men did a risk assessment, and the school hired 4 of those young men to provide unarmed security there. And in New York City, we also have a program. We're working to expand this across the United States. We're also working in New York City with the Asian American Federation to protect Asian American and Pacific Islander community against hate crimes. And so as part of their Hope Against Hate campaign, we've been one of their main training partners. Our director of mutual protection, Carlian Mendoza, he's trained over 2,000 people, and that work is training the community how to keep themselves safe and protect one another as well. So in the Philippines, Nonviolent Peaceforce, this is our longest standing program. So we're part of the peace process between the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and we monitor the ceasefire to try and stop violations and from occurring, and so and to provide protection for civilians. So because we've built relationships and are deeply immersed in the communities, we're able to sometimes stop a ceasefire violation before it happens. And we also provide training to give people alternatives. So like we train youth on peace building. Now, when we started here in 2007, the conflict was very active. In 2008, we were there when displaced people were fleeing out of the mountains. And then now it's at a stage where there is a peace agreement, and they've been implementing this peace agreement for an autonomous region. So Nonviolent Peaceforce, as part of our work, also trained armed groups in international humanitarian law and grave child protection human rights. And when our director of organizational advancement was there this summer, they got a call from a community member who was concerned that there was an armed group sheltering in one of the local elementary schools. And so Nonviolent Peaceforce began to head over there to talk with them, and called the commander on the phone. And he said, yes, we know we're violating this human right, or this child protection, grave human right, and we're leaving, we're getting out of here. And so they left. So we just have been able to build great relationships that have really helped with the response there. And then in South Sudan, we have women's protection teams. These teams are women, mainly civilians, mainly women who've come forward, who want to provide safety and security in their own communities. There's over 2,500 women across the country involved in these groups, and there's over 66 groups. And the women are, deeply immersed in the community, so they can sense or can see when things that are dangerous are happening, when people stop going to the market, if children aren't going to school to go meet with armed leaders or armed groups, if people are talking about a cattle raid coming up, and then they're able to use their training and to respond and intervene to stop violent situations from happening. So like I said, in one case, there was a group of young men or boys who were like, we're men now, we're going to go fight as soldiers, and we're going to go meet armed leaders, and wanted to join up as soldiers, and the women intervened and talked to them and convinced them to go back to school. So they're able to stop them from doing that. The women work on stopping gender-based violence, and they have their own initiatives. So there was two groups of women protection teams who are from different ethnic groups, and they decided that they wanted to take action because there was a lot of violence happening against their community from a local armed group. And so they decided that they were going to march to the commander of this group and talk to him. And so they slowly came together over 2 hours, joining each other. And they got to the point where the commander is supposed to be, and a soldier was like, he's not here. And they said, that's fine, we'll just wait. So they waited there, and he eventually came. They talked for 2 hours, and he denied everything. He said, you know, we're not the ones sexually assaulting your women. We're not the ones killing people in your community. It wasn't us. But they had a very long talk about their concerns, and the women left. And after that, that local armed group stopped targeting the people in their community. So this is just to conclude, at Nonviolent Peaceforce, we reimagine safety, and we think about peace is not just the absence of violence or fear of violence, but it's institutions. There's positive peace. It's the institutions and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. And that everyone has the capacity, each of us already has the capacity to build true safety, and belonging already exists in all of us. Oh, and I'm realizing I'm showing my slide wrong again. Okay. I'm going to drop my contact information in the chat. Nonviolent Peaceforce's work takes $24 million a year to do the work, and there's a crucial gap that we have where our supporters are able to fill to help provide capacity to do that work, to start new programs, and to support advocacy. And so if anybody would like to volunteer or be involved, please feel free to contact me. And I guess I'm opening it up to questions here. I don't know how to unmute her. There.
Hi.
Okay.
First of all, thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. I learned quite a bit and appreciate all the work that you guys have done. I had 2 questions. So you said people volunteering, do you ever send them over to conflict areas? Or is that, because you mentioned a lot about local, which I think is really good, but sometimes there's, you know, different treatment of people from other countries. And I'm wondering if you ever purposely send someone from a different country over to various areas.
We do have international staff. We don't actually take volunteers to the areas we're working. Everybody is paid, and that's when the organization began. They wanted to make sure that we could have people long-term who could sustain that. And also in terms of equity, we didn't just want people who had power and privilege to, you know, be able to afford not to work, or who could just sustain volunteering. And we wanted to hire also local people as well. So yeah, we just have like volunteering locally, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then
you have like the volunteers you have are local volunteers though sometimes?
Yeah, and we have different chapters across the states as well. Not in Wisconsin, but we have one in Chicago. Yeah, that help do training for people. They do fundraising support, educate others as well. You had a second question?
The second one was really about safety, but it sounds like you've kind of addressed it a little bit for your staff, your professional staff. I'm sure you worry about them quite a bit. Have you had any bad situations with your staff or?
So we haven't had anyone who's been killed as a result of our work. I know that has happened with other organizations. We have had issues, but we have really strict protocols, and we try and just look at what the situation is happening, whether we need to evacuate people or put them in lockdown, if there's active shooting or bombing going on. And sometimes also there's just like we had a driver who was shot, but not because of Nonviolent Peaceforce. He was just in South Sudan when the war started and got caught in the crossfire as well.
So I have a question that's kind of an extension to that. Because earlier there was a question, how do you keep your staff safe? And you did answer that in the presentation. And at the end, when you said like the last bit about some of the work you do, my thought was like when these women, for example, are able to talk down this armed group about sexually assaulting women as a means of warfare. Do you think that part of that is just basically reminding people of everyone's humanity in these conflicts? And so it's not just like your enemy, it's like, this is a human being and this is what you're doing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, they're working on, they went to build a relationship with that group, and then they're realizing like, these women are women like the women we know, like they could be my mother or my sister or my daughter. And so yeah, I think it's definitely a lot harder when it's easier to target people from afar and you don't know them, for sure.
Amy, I thought that your presentation was quite comprehensive, and obviously the staff and people who work through this program are extremely courageous. As you spoke, and from a national or international perspective, but also bringing it back home locally, I kept thinking about some of the violence we're seeing across the U.S. in our cities, and wondered if some of the principles of your program, you alluded to this, but I think it was in your area, but I wondered how that might impact our cities, if they could even, maybe not the whole program, but get some of those lessons or teachings, if that might be impactful in terms of managing some of what we're seeing in the streets across the U.S.
Yeah, we are looking at different areas, and of course, we're building up this model so that we hope that other organizations can also take this on in different areas as well. But we are looking at expanding in different areas. I know one of the areas that they're looking at is Milwaukee, but it also depends on our capacity as well, to grow, not just in terms of funding, but it just it takes a long time to find the staff to do this, and yeah, to begin building up the program, identifying what's going on in the area as well. So yeah.
What are your principal sources of funding? And in particular, do you get money from USAID? I ask this because Friends Committee on National Legislation advocacy teams this year are focusing on some of the funding for nonviolent efforts, peaceful efforts within the appropriations budget. And I'd like to know if Nonviolent Peaceforce is among those organizations that might benefit from this advocacy.
So yes, we do get funding from them. And I'm sorry, I just also forgot something else I wanted to mention to Mary. We do offer trainings, but it's kind of like we also want to pay the staff for the time. So it's usually paid trainings if someone asks us, and then it would depend on the group how much it is. And but we are looking at you know, expanding programs across the US as well. So we get funding from government institutions, including USAID. I don't know. We got funding from the Canadian Friends Service Committee as well. That might be a good fit. Different UN bodies or agencies, the EU.
And
So
United Nations as well, or not?
Yeah, and the United Nations, different bodies of the United Nations. So, which is varied throughout the years, but yeah, we've definitely get funding from them. I'd say the majority of our funding is from government institutions, a lot of European governments.
Scandinavian, probably.
Amy, thank you for your presentation. I'll echo others. And I appreciated hearing how your organization has evolved to meet needs along the way, from what it sounds like. I was curious, excuse me, from your bio, it mentions Myanmar, that you had spent time there. Does Nonviolent Peaceforce currently have programs in Myanmar?
Yes, we do have a program there. We're not reporting on it as much because of the security situation. And a lot of our work had to be done through Zoom when COVID started. So also with the coup, our international staff had to go to the border of Thailand and stayed connected with our national staff through Zoom to provide support. A lot of the work also focused on digital security. So yeah, that's becoming an increasing
I was
issue.
wondering. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And there was a related question earlier in the chat about what work is Nonviolent Peaceforce doing in the Sahel and other areas in Africa with the rise of Islamic extremism there.
So we have done training for I believe it's youth in that area, providing a course on unarmed civilian protection online to a number of youth. And in certain areas, we've been able to take that work and start implementing it on the ground. But right now, that's as far as we have advanced. There's a number of areas where people have invited us to go and do work, and Nonviolent Peaceforce just unfortunately cannot respond. We don't have the capacity to respond to every conflict that we're invited to.
Here's another UN question. I believe this year Secretary Guterres is going to be setting out a new agenda for peace. And one of the things he talks about is more a reformed peacekeeping, and then sometimes a more robust peacekeeping, meaning that they would be more equipped with force for protection. And I'm wondering, is there going to, do you have any connections there that you could get some kind of proposal or shout out from the Secretary General in this agenda for unarmed civilian protection? and coordination with peacekeeping missions?
So I might have to get back to you on that, but I know they were putting a panel together to hear from organizations. And so Nonviolent Peaceforce, let me see.
I mean, it's something that should really be pushed as much as, like right now, there's about a $7 billion peacekeeping budget. And I'm sure that the people who do unarmed civilian protection would just get just a fraction of that in terms of budgets. But it might be the kind of thing that should be promoted and included in this agenda for peace.
We do have someone who works on advocacy at the UN 20 hours a week for us. Our UN representative, Gay Rosenblum Kumar. I'd have to get back to you if this is the same. They're giving recommendations that they've asked organizations to give their thoughts on. And so I know she said that we will be giving our recommendations as well, but the UN is also very bureaucratic, and it's very hard to make change there.
Sure.
And there's also some politics with certain areas of the UN, because you know, if you're taking away money from armed peacekeeping to do unarmed civilian protection or peacekeeping, the groups that are getting that funding might not be so happy with that, and have also expressed that to Nonviolent Peaceforce.
Oh, that's tragic.
But there is a lot of support through different like the country missions, certain country missions, and groups at the UN as well. So
thank you.
I want to ask a question. Since you said you get funding from government institutions, how can you stay neutral and not? People might think maybe you just doing the work of the government and not neutral.
So one of the things is we're careful about the funding we take. You know, we don't want to be mandated by that funding to do certain work. And so we go in and start programs, usually with funding from individuals, and build up those programs and then apply for funding. So it's already programming that Nonviolent Peaceforce has put together. We're also careful, like for instance, with USAID, at times we haven't taken that funding in certain countries because of the US and its involvement in those countries as well. But yeah, I think we're able to be independent as well, because we do get support from individuals, and we have a number of different funding sources too. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Amy. Mary, did you want to say some final words?
I want to say thank you. And I want to echo what Karen said in her chat about it was interesting and informative. And just, you know, my hat's off to your organization for their commitment and the courage that they show in going in and working with different countries and also on a local level, but very interesting. I appreciate you giving your time, Amy. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our participants.
For everyone. Yeah. Thank you for coming.